If you think your family drama is bad, buckle up, because this woman went from a low-ranking palace servant to queen, and helped launch a royal blood feud that lasted 45 years, making Game of Thrones look like a cute little bedtime story. And the cause of this historical dumpster fire was Fredegund of Neustria, a woman who may have been one of the most ruthless queens in European history, or one of its most aggressively slandered. Probably both. Most of what we know about Fredegund comes from Gregory of Tours, a bishop who personally knew this royal family and lived through the events. Which is amazing, except for the fact that Gregory absolutely hated Fredegund and her husband, so he's just a teensy-weensy bit biased. We do have a few other records, poems, letters, and such to help check parts of his story, but for many of the wildest accusations, Gregory is still the only narrator we have, which makes this a very wild ride, because Fredegund lived the story, but one of her enemies got to tell it. Fredegund's story begins in the middle of the 6th century, when the Frankish kingdoms covered much of modern France, Belgium, Germany, and the surrounding area. It was a whole empire. The rulers of that empire were called the Merovingians. And the Merovingian family's main approach to conflict resolution was basically, get out of my way before I move you out of my way. Now, when a Merovingian king died, his territory could be split among his surviving sons, very Alexander the Great style, which we all saw how well that worked out, right? So in 561, King 𝐂𝐻lothar I died and split his kingdom among his 4 sons. Oh goody! The main sons you need to care about for this insane story are Chilperic, Sigibert, and Guntram. Of course, the brothers immediately started fighting over cities, borders, money, marriages, and who had received the better piece of Dad's kingdom, like, I call dibs first. And all of that squabbling hits hard when Fredegund enters the scene and starts throwing her special brand of chaos into pretty much everything. Now, Fredegund was probably born sometime in the 540s, allegedly to a palace servant, basically securing her future as a palace maid. She's growing up mopping floors, clearing chamber pots, and maybe, if she's lucky, helping the royals put on their fancy clothes. She somehow entered the house of King Chilperic, one of the 4 sons of King 𝐂𝐻lothar I, and she quickly goes from servant to sweetheart, maybe winning Chilperic over with her beauty or something. And because even kings tend to think with their down theirs, Fredegund rapidly starts gaining influence over Chilperic. Which is a problem, because Chilperic already had a wife named Adovera, and they had several children together. But lovers come and go in royal households, so no biggie, right? Fredegund was not threatened by frumpy Queen What's-Her-Face, until Chilperic's brother Sigibert did something that triggers that sibling jealousy all over again. He married a legitimate foreign princess. Her name was Brunhilda. Brunhilda was the daughter of the Visigothic king of Spain. She arrived with enormous wealth, converted to Catholic Christianity, and immediately gave Sigibert's court an impressive royal alliance. Chilperic looked at his brother's glamorous international marriage and apparently thought, I need to get me one of those. So he asked for Brunhilda's older sister, Galswintha. Keep it in the family, right? Her father agreed, but only after Chilperic promised to abandon his other women and treat Galswintha as his legitimate queen. And of course, Chilperic said no problem. She will have my heart and my soul and my down there and nobody else. Trust me, bro. So before long, Galswintha arrived with a massive dowry and married Chilperic. And initially, he treated her well. I'm assuming, although we're not quite sure, that he divorces his first wife, Adovera, and for a while, things are great with Galswintha. But all new toys lose their shine, and Chilperic was apparently still in love with Fredegund, so it didn't take long for this new royal marriage to fall apart. Galswintha starts complaining that she is being humiliated and mistreated, but nothing changes. Eventually, she offers to leave her dowry and riches behind if Chilperic will just let her go home. It sounds like a great deal, But that would be kind of embarrassing for 𝐂𝐴𝐻𝐿, so no can do. Instead, he sweet-talks her down, promising to change. Then, according to Gregory, 𝐂𝐴𝐻𝐿 ordered one of his servants to sneak into Galswintha's bedchambers and give her a nice little squeeze into the afterlife. And a few days later, 𝐂𝐴𝐻𝐿 marries Fredegund. Now this is where people usually say Fredegund had Galswintha. But look, did she benefit from this? Absolutely, 100%. But historic sources specifically say that 𝐂𝐴𝐻𝐿 gave the order. So who knows? Maybe Fredegund encouraged it. We've all seen those psycho lady movies on Lifetime. But let's get real for a second. This was a girl who grew up as a servant, then became lover to the king. And we cannot ignore the fact that this dude had some issues, and there was a very real power dynamic going on. Either way, whether Fredegund helped orchestrate this or not, one thing is true. Galswintha is no longer in the land of the living, and her sister Brunhilda has just watched some nobody take the crown practically right off her sister's head. Brunhilda was 𝐂𝐴𝐻𝐿's and now Fredegund's sister-in-law and queen of the neighboring kingdom, and Brunhilda was pissed off, which launches one of the longest, nastiest royal feuds in European history. Naturally, a war exploded between 𝐂𝐴𝐻𝐿 and his brother Sigibert almost immediately. At first, Sigibert appeared to be winning. By 575, 𝐂𝐴𝐻𝐿 had been captured in the city of Tournai after his own nobles started abandoning him, and Sigibert's soldiers were making preparations to delete 𝐂𝐴𝐻𝐿 and take over his kingdom. Frederick was about to lose her crown, her protection, and quite probably her life. No better time to get creative, right? So she sends 2 of her men into Sigibert's camp, carrying poisoned knives. Gregory also says Fredegund had placed them under a magical charm, because apparently regular assassinations were not theatrical enough, and God forbid a woman be clever without being a witch, am I right? But the plan worked. The men managed to sneak up to Sigibert and strike before the guards could stop them. Bye, Sigibert, see you in the afterlife. The 2 attackers didn't survive, but 𝐂𝐴𝐻𝐿 escaped successfully, and Fredegund remained queen. Now, Brunhilda had lost both her sister and her husband. Her rage was probably visible at this point, and it gets worse for her. Her young son, Childebert, was smuggled to safety and proclaimed King of Austrasia. But Brunhilda was captured and sent into exile to a city called Rouen in northwest France. And this should have been the end of it, right? But instead of fading away into exile, it's not long before 𝐂𝐴𝐻𝐿's own son decides to marry Brunhilda. Meet Merovech. Merovech was 𝐂𝐴𝐻𝐿's adult son from his first marriage to Audovera, remember her? This made Fredegund his stepmother. While visiting Rouen, Merovech met the widowed Brunhilda, his father's enemy and technically his aunt by marriage. And like many spoiled, entitled brats with too much money, Merovech thought to himself, if I marry this chick, it'd be like the ultimate middle finger to dad and that stupid new wife. So of course, Merovech and Brunhilda get married, which means that Fredegund's archenemy was now also her stepson's wife. The family tree has officially curled into a ball and started to cry. Naturally, 𝐂𝐴𝐻𝐿 was furious, and he came after the 2 newlyweds, but the couple rushed into a church and claimed sanctuary, while 𝐂𝐴𝐻𝐿 stood outside, promising, very sincerely of course, that he definitely was not planning to do anything rash. Brunhilda manages to escape and flee back to Austrasia, where her young son Childebert II is king, but they don't let Merovech in. Sorry, hubby, you're on your own. Peace. Eventually, Merovech gets trapped by his father's supporters, and reportedly has one of his own companions send him gently into the afterlife to avoid a worse fate. Another potential rival is gone, and Brunhilda is in protection, probably licking her wounds and coming up with a revenge plan. And keep in mind, while all of this queen-on-queen drama was going down, the kings were still waging their own messy side wars, but we'd be here till next Tuesday if we unpacked all of that, so forgive me if I skip over a few map changes here. Because in the meantime, Fredegund is experiencing an absolute saga's worth of tragedy. First, she loses her infant son, Samson, in 577. Then, in 580, a brutal dysentery epidemic spread through the Frankish kingdoms. Two more of Fredegund's sons, Clodobert and Dagobert, become seriously ill. She tells Chilperic that their children were dying because the royal treasury had been filled through the tears of poor families, widows, and orphans. So she ordered the royal tax records to be brought out, the books listing what people owed, and threw them into the fire. Next, she convinced Chilperic to stop collecting those taxes altogether. But it didn't save the boys. She lost them both. The grieving parents went from shrine to shrine, made vows, and held enormous funerals. Their pain was visible to the entire kingdom, but that didn't stop the vultures from circling. Enter Chilperic's son, Clovis. Like Merovich, Clovis is also from Chilperic's first marriage. Whatever happened to that poor woman? After Fredegund's two sons died during the epidemic, Clovis apparently started bragging that their deaths had made him the rightful heir to the kingdom, and because big mouths never know when to shut up, he also allegedly made insulting comments about his stepmother. "Dumb idea, Clovis, you can't insult the girl." Understandably agitated, Chilperic ordered Clovis to be secretly captured, and Big Mouth Clovis ends up shackled, stripped of his weapons and clothes, and then paraded before Fredegund wearing rags. Then he's sent to the prison to be kept under guard. 3 days later, Fredegund ordered him to be transferred to an estate at Noisy-le-Grand, east of Paris, where, surprise, surprise, Clovis is magically found sleeping the everlasting sleep. Messengers came to relay the news to Chilperic, claiming that the wound was self-inflicted and that he had already been buried out of respect. This would not have been normal, by the way. So another relative of Chilperic and threat to Fredegund has conveniently disappeared. But unfortunately for her, things just kept getting worse for Fredegund. In 584, she lost another young son, Theodoric. And now Fredegund's grief turns into anger. She's become convinced that witchcraft has caused her son to be taken from her. So like any grieving queen with endless money and even more infinite rage, Fredegund launches a palace investigation. Women in Paris were rounded up and questioned under brutal pressure until they confessed to magic. Many of them received fatal punishments. After Fredegund's vengeful tirade against the so-called witches, she gathered everything that had belonged to Theodoric, his clothes, his expensive fabrics, and personal belongings. 4 wagonfuls full of stuff. Once it was collected, she burned it all. Then she melted down his gold and silver so nothing would remain in its original form to remind her of him. Talk about heartbreaking and terrifying. Fredegund clearly loved her children, and she loved them with the emotional stability of a medieval nuclear weapon. Fredegund also had a daughter named Ringuth. In 584, Ringuth was supposed to marry a Visigothic prince in Spain. This was a massive international royal wedding, so Fredegund gave her daughter enough gold, silver, clothing, and jewelry to fill 50 wagons, like an insane amount of wealth. Chilperic saw this treasure leaving and basically said, excuse me, is that our entire bank account? Fredegund insisted that it was all her personal property acquired from estates, revenue, tribute, and gifts. It's totally separate money, babe, don't worry about it. Ringuth was also sent off with an escort of approximately 4,000 soldiers, servants, nobles, horses, and wagons, so these families were essentially forced to leave their homes behind and travel with her to a foreign land. People were literally crying in the streets of Paris as relatives were separated. Then, as Ringuth left the city, one of the wagon axles snapped. The crowd reportedly cried out, "Mala hora," which means bad hour or bad time. So brace yourself, because historical foreshadowing has entered the plotline. That first night, 50 men deserted, stealing 100 of the best horses, golden bridles, and jewelry. More members of the convoy fled along the route, grabbing whatever they could. Meanwhile, the remaining escort looted food, livestock, and wine from poor communities as it traveled south. So Rigund's fairy tale wedding procession had become a 4,000-person royal road trip where the guests robbed both the bride and every village they passed. And it was about to get worse. While Rigund's convoy was still traveling, King Chilperic returned from hunting at his estate near Paris. As he dismounted his horse in the evening, an unidentified attacker appeared and struck him. Chilperic was yeeted almost immediately into the afterlife, and the attacker was never conclusively identified. Was it Brunhilde? Rival nobles at court? Like, this dude had no shortage of enemies and people to benefit from his death. It could have even been Fredegund for all we know. Anything's possible. When the news reached Toulouse, a duke named Desiderius seized Rigund's treasure and placed the princess under guard before the wedding even happened. Of course, amid the chaos, her enormous dowry completely disappeared. Eventually, Fredegund sent men to retrieve her, and Rigund came home humiliated, unmarried, and with most of her property gone. When a court official returned and told Fredegund how badly her daughter had been treated, Fredegund responded by blaming and punishing the people who had been traveling with her. Because nothing says healthy coping like attacking the messenger. Meanwhile, Fredegund had much bigger problems. Her husband was gone, enemies were closing in, and her only surviving young son, 𝐂𝐡𝐚𝐩𝐿, was still an infant. Things were not looking good for Fredegund. Immediately after Chilperic's death, Fredegund took sanctuary inside the cathedral in Paris. Brunhilde's son, Childebert, demanded that she be handed over so he could avenge his father, his aunt, and all the other relatives whose deaths were blamed on her. But King Guntram, Chilperic's other surviving brother, refused. He said Fredegund had a son who was king, and that he did not necessarily believe all of the accusations against her. But Guntram also had some doubts about whether this baby was actually Chilperic's. So Fredegund, 3 bishops, and 300 Neustrian nobles had to formally swear that he was. Just a casual 300-person paternity statement, no biggie. 𝐂𝐡𝐚 was officially recognized as King of Neustria, with Fredegund acting as his protector and regent, the political power behind the throne. This was arguably her greatest accomplishment. She had entered the palace as a lowly maid, and now, as a widowed mother with enemies on every border, she had managed to preserve an entire kingdom for her infant son. And, as would be expected, Brunhilde now had an extra big X on her back. Allegedly, Fredegund continually sent assassins after Brunhilde, the young King Childebert, King Guntram, and any bishops who opposed her. And if you, like me, are wondering what did Guntram do to deserve a hit job, he kept trying to control her kingdom behind her back, and Fredegund didn't do babysitters. Seriously, this woman didn't play around. Any threat to her son's future reign would be eliminated at all costs, and she was ruthless about it too. In the 590s, an Austrasian army entered Neustrian territory and badly outnumbered Fredegund's forces. If you saw my short on this, you know where this is going. Fredegund ordered the entire front line of her men to carry tree branches with small bells attached to their horses. Then the army advanced through the night. From a distance, enemy guards supposedly thought the branches were a forest, and that the bells came from their own horses grazing nearby. One account even claims that the guards thought the forest was magically coming to life and fled. Either way, nobody sounded the alarm to wake the sleeping soldiers, so at dawn, Fredegund's soldiers dropped the branches and attacked the unprepared camp. It's basically the medieval equivalent of the forest marching toward Macbeth, but with horse accessories. Another score for Fredegund, master of cunning and cleverness. And somehow, Fredegund's political enemies were not even responsible for her most chaotic feud. That honor belongs to her daughter, Rigund. After returning from her failed wedding journey, Rigund began insisting that she was the true royal woman of the family. According to Gregory, Rigund repeatedly reminded Fredegund that she had been born to a low-ranking servant background. Rigund was a king's biological daughter, Therefore, Fredegund argued, her mother should be serving her. They insulted each other, they slapped each other. It was like a Kardashians episode. Except everyone had private armies. One day, Fredegund suddenly became very calm. She invited Fredegund into the royal treasury and said, "Why do you hate me, daughter? Come, take your father's things and do whatever you want with them." Fredegund opened a chest filled with jewelry and began handing pieces to Fredegund. Great peace offering. Then she said she was tired and told Fredegund to reach inside for the rest. When Fredegund leaned over the chest, Fredegund slammed the lid down on her head and neck and held it there. A maid screamed for help, and people waiting outside rushed in to pull Fredegund free. She survived, but the mother-daughter relationship did not. I'm not a family therapist, but I think once somebody slams a chest on your head, the relationship may be beyond repair. And despite all of the chaos and all of the insanity, Fredegund died in her bed of natural causes in 597, probably around 50 years old. She was still the queen mother with her son's kingdom intact. Naturally, her good son, King 𝐂𝐻lothar, continued the war against Brunhilde's family, because grudges be grudges, man. And in 613, 16 years after Fredegund's death, 𝐂𝐻lothar finally defeated Brunhilde, subjected her to a public trial, and ordered an exceptionally brutal Control-Alt-Delete. The son Fredegund had protected as a baby finally united the Frankish kingdoms, ruling over them all. So politically speaking, Fredegund's side won. After everything she went through, from her servant upbringing to the chaotic way she gained the crown, all the things she did, and all the people she allegedly yeeted to keep that crown, the children she lost, all of it, she won. I mean, she didn't get to see it, but hey, it happened eventually. And perhaps craziest of all, she left behind a reputation so terrifying that 1,500 years later, people still cannot decide whether she was an evil mastermind, a brilliant survivor, or a woman whose enemies left her carrying the blame for an entire dynasty's crimes. Personally, I think she was all three. Comment below if you want the equally wild Brunhilde side of this feud. And if you think Fredegund's wild story sounded ruthless, check out our episode on Catalina de Arasso, the fugitive nun who spent 2 decades fighting in men's armor across the Spanish Empire. I'll link that in the show notes. Until next time, keep your receipts, cause a little chaos, and go call your mother. She'd wipe out a royal lineage for you in a heartbeat.